Chapter 6: Sun-Drenched Days and Simmering Nights. The days following the storm, both the literal downpour and the metaphorical one with Polo, unfolded with a strange, almost surreal quality. It was as if we'd entered a new, unspoken agreement, a tentative truce in the war between my head and my heart, and, let's be honest, my hormones. Polo didn't disappear, as I'd half expected, and perhaps a small cowardly part of me had hoped. He didn't ghost me, didn't retreat into the safe, predictable world of fraternity parties and fleeting hookups. Instead, he persisted. But it wasn't the aggressive, overtly sexual pursuit I'd braced myself for. It was something subtler, more insidious, more effective. He started showing up at the gardens, not during my lunch break, when I was alone and vulnerable, but during the busiest hours, when the place was swarming with visitors. He'd bring iced coffee, black, 2 sugars, exactly how I liked it, damn him for remembering, and he'd help out watering plants, carrying bags of soil, even charming the notoriously grumpy Mrs. Henderson into buying an overpriced orchid. He was helpful, charming, funny, and infuriatingly respectful. He kept his hands to himself mostly. There were the occasional accidental brushes of skin, his hand against mine as he handed me a trowel, his arm brushing against my back as he leaned in to point out a rare bloom, his shoulder bumping against mine as we walked side by side down a narrow path. Each fleeting touch sent a jolt of awareness through me, a reminder of the fire that had ignited between us, a fire I was trying desperately to keep banked, to control. He'd ask about my sculpture, genuinely interested in the process, the inspiration, the challenges. He'd listen, really listen, his blue eyes focused on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. He'd offer surprisingly insightful observations, ask thoughtful questions, and even, on one occasion, help me wrestle a particularly stubborn piece of metal into place, his strength a tangible, almost overwhelming presence. We talked about everything and nothing, about our families, his surprisingly close-knit despite the looming shadow of his father's expectations, mine, a small, fiercely independent unit of 2. About our dreams, his surprisingly uncertain, a conflict between the path laid out for him and a yearning for something more, mine, clear and unwavering, a burning desire to create, to express, to leave my mark on the world. About our fears, his of failing to live up to expectations, of losing himself in the process, mine of vulnerability, of intimacy, of losing my independence. He even managed to charm my mother, bringing her a bouquet of sunflowers, her favorite, and engaging her in a surprisingly knowledgeable conversation about rare species of orchids. I watched them, a mixture of amusement and trepidation swirling within me, as they discussed the intricacies of pollination and propagation, Polo hanging on her every word, his expression one of genuine interest. He's different than I expected, my mother admitted later, a thoughtful frown creasing her forehead. More grounded, more real. Don't get any ideas, Mom, I said quickly, my cheeks flushing. We're just friends. She raised a skeptical eyebrow, but thankfully didn't push. But even as we grew closer, even as I started to see beyond the frat boy facade, to the complex, intelligent, surprisingly sensitive man beneath, the tension, the attraction remained. It simmered just below the surface, a constant, throbbing undercurrent to every interaction. There were moments, fleeting but intense, when the carefully constructed distance between us would evaporate. Like the time we were walking through the rose garden, discussing the symbolism of different flowers, and he reached out, seemingly without thinking, and tucked a stray curl behind my ear, his fingers brushing against my skin, sending a shiver down my spine. Or the time we were laughing at something Leander had said. Leander, bless his enormous, oblivious heart, had become an unlikely ally, a buffer against Zeph's increasingly hostile glares and snide remarks. And our eyes met, and for a split second the laughter died in my throat, replaced by a raw, aching awareness. And then there were the almost kisses. One evening, after a long day at the gardens, we were sitting on the porch steps of my cottage, sharing a bottle of wine, a surprisingly good Pinot Noir he'd brought, claiming Eros had educated him on the finer things in life. The air was warm and still, the scent of honeysuckle heavy and sweet. We were talking about our childhoods, sharing silly stories, laughing easily. And then a silence fell, a comfortable silence, but a silence charged with unspoken longing. He was sitting close, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the faint scent of his cologne, that intoxicating mix of sandalwood and citrus. He looked at me, his eyes dark and intense in the fading light, and I knew with absolute certainty that he was going to kiss me. My heart hammered against my ribs, my breath caught in my throat. I wanted him to kiss me. God, I wanted him to kiss me. But I also didn't. I was terrified. terrified of losing control, of surrendering to the desire that threatened to consume me, of shattering the fragile peace we'd established. He leaned in, his hand reaching out to cup my cheek, his thumb gently stroking my skin. I closed my eyes, bracing myself, anticipating the touch of his lips on mine. And then a car horn blared, loud and insistent, shattering the moment. We both jumped, startled, pulling apart as Riv's battered VW Beetle screeched to a halt in front of the cottage. "Daph, movie night, let's go," Riv yelled, leaning out the window, her eyes gleaming with mischief. The spell was broken. The moment was gone. I stood up, my legs feeling a little shaky. "That's my cue," I said, forcing a smile. "Rain check?" Polo nodded, his expression unreadable. "Definitely," he said, his voice a little rough. He watched me go, his gaze intense, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. Another time it happened at a small get-together that Phi Delta Gamma had. It was at a brother's summer home, out near the water. Most knew of the tension between Polo and Zeph, and did their best to ignore it. Orpheus made a comment about how it was a shame the sunset was blocked out by the trees. We were on a raised deck in the back of the house. I remember thinking to myself how nice the house was, how even the average brother of this frat was well off. Polo led me away and down to the water. He held my hand, and I felt a slight shock. We sat on the end of the dock, legs dangling over the edge. I watched the sunset, a glorious explosion of color, reflecting off the calm water. Polo watched me. I turned to say something and found him incredibly close. His face was illuminated by the fading sunlight, his blue eyes dark and intense. He was so close I could feel his breath on my cheek, could smell the faint scent of beer and that intoxicating cologne he wore. He didn't say anything, just looked at me, his gaze searching mine. I felt my heart pounding, my pulse racing. I knew what was coming, what I wanted to come, but still, I hesitated. He raised his hand, his fingers brushing against my cheek, tracing the line of my jaw. I leaned into his touch, unconsciously, my eyes fluttering closed. Then his phone rang, the ringtone ominous and distinct. Polo swore under his breath, a frustrated sound, and pulled back. "It's my father. I have to take this," he said, a wry smile twisting his lips. But I saw the flicker of disappointment in his eyes, mirroring my own. These near misses, these almost kisses, were becoming a pattern, a constant reminder of the simmering tension between us, of the fire we were both trying so hard to control. They were, in their own way, more tortuous, more exquisite than if we'd actually given in to the desire. The anticipation, the almost, was a constant delicious ache. And it was clear, at least to me, that Polo was struggling. I saw it in the way his jaw clenched when he held himself back, in the way his eyes darkened with barely suppressed desire, in the way his hands would sometimes tremble when he touched me, even casually. He was fighting his instincts, his possessiveness, his overwhelming need to claim me. And perversely, that restraint, that control, only made him more attractive, more dangerous. I, on the other hand, was starting to question my own resolve. The walls I'd built around my heart, around my independence, were showing cracks. I found myself thinking about him constantly, replaying our conversations, reliving those fleeting moments of physical contact, craving more. I found myself, almost unconsciously, dressing with him in mind, choosing the sundress that showed off my shoulders, the shorts that emphasized my legs, the tank top that clung to my curves. I found myself touching the silver earrings he'd bought me, the delicate thorns and leaves, a constant reminder of his presence, of his interest. And the dreams were becoming increasingly vivid, increasingly erotic, filled with images of his hands on my skin, his mouth on mine, his body, everywhere. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, my body aching with a desire I was trying so desperately to deny. I knew I was playing with fire. I knew I was headed for heartbreak, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. I was drawn to him, to his intensity, to his hidden vulnerability, to the raw, undeniable power of the attraction between us. I was a moth, fluttering closer and closer to the flame, knowing I would get burned, but unable, unwilling to turn away. The question was, how badly would I get burned? And more importantly, was it worth it? The answer, I feared, was a resounding, terrifying, exhilarating yes.